Welcome. I'm Pastor Dennis Keller of First United Methodist Church in Mechanicsburg, and I'm glad that you've tuned in to our sermon for this week. We pray that as you listen to this message that it will be a blessing for you. If you'd like to find out more about First Church, we welcome you to visit our website, fumchurch.com. May the Lord bless and keep you. This week, the theme of our daily Bible reading that we've been involved in is leadership. And the passage from this week's reading that I wanted to focus on this morning is found in John's Gospel, chapter 13, beginning at verse 1. Receive God's word through the Gospel of John. Before the festival of Passover, Jesus knew that his time had come to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them fully. Jesus and his disciples were sharing the evening meal. The devil had already provoked Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew the Father had given everything into his hands, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the table and took off his robes. Picking up a linen towel, he tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a wash basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he was wearing. When Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't understand what I'm doing now, but you will understand later." "No," Peter said, "you will never wash my feet." Jesus replied, "Unless I wash you, you won't have a place with me." Simon Peter said, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Jesus responded, "Those who have bathed need only to have their feet washed, because they are completely clean. You disciples are clean, but not every one of you." He knew who would betray him. That's why he said, "Not every one of you is clean." After he washed the disciples' feet, he put on his robes and returned to his place at the table. He said to them, "Do you know what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you speak correctly because I am. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you too must wash each other's feet. I have given you an example. Just as I have done, you also must do. I assure you, servants aren't greater than their master, nor are those who are sent greater than the one who sent them. Since you know these things, you will be happy if you do them." This is the word of the Lord. Once again this morning we've included some teaching notes, and I invite you to follow along as we go through this message together. As I mentioned, our theme this week is leadership. You know, all of us lead in some way, whether we realize it or not. Perhaps we lead in our homes, raising our children to come to know God's love. We may lead in our workplaces where others know us as encouragers and perhaps as prayer warriors. Some of us lead in our schools, creating a safe place for young people to learn and discover and grow. You know, we're never too old to influence the people around us. A couple of weeks ago, my cousin's husband passed away at Chapel Point over in Carlisle. Harold suffered from Parkinson's disease for the past several years, and at the age of 88, these past several weeks were especially difficult for him. His son, Tom, called me the day that his dad passed away. Tom and I have been friends since we were in kindergarten together. And Tom told me that every day, as family members gathered around Harold's bedside, other residents from the home would stop by, and members of the nursing staff would stop by, and friends from the community would stop by, and they would all talk about the influence that Harold had on their lives. They would talk about his faith. They would talk about how kind and loving he was. And it reminded me, as Tom and I were having this conversation, that we are never too old. Even to our last breath, we can have influence on others. And we're also never too young to influence others. Even the smallest child has influence. How wonderful is the enthusiastic welcome of a child at the end of a tiring day. Mommy's home, Daddy's home, or better yet, Grammy's here, Pap-Pap's here. And how wonderful it is when a child invites us to play and we're reminded not to take ourselves too seriously. No matter how old you are, no matter how young you are, you have influence. If you are a Christian, the light of God shines in your life. And the question I want to ask this morning is this: what do you do with the influence God has given you? In this gospel reading from John 13, Jesus calls us to use the influence we have to serve others. He calls us to be servant leaders. Now, those two words, servant and leader, don't seem to belong together. Usually we think of a servant as someone who takes orders and a leader as someone who gives orders. A person is either one or the other, but not both. And yet in his life, in his ministry, Jesus shows us how to be both a leader and a servant. And here in this passage, he models what that looks like in a most powerful way. He shows us, first of all, that servant leadership requires love. Look at verse 1. Before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his time had come to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them fully. Now, John tells us two things in just that one verse. First, he tells us that Jesus knows his time has come to leave the world. Soon he will suffer and die. Soon he will no longer be with them. And second, John tells us about the love that Jesus has for his disciples. He loves them as his own. And he loves them fully, or as other translations, he loves them to the end. Servant leaders are people that love those that God brings into their lives. What does it look like for you to fully love the people God brings into your life? To fully love your family, your friends, your co-workers, your students, your teachers, your neighbors in the same way that Jesus loved his own. When we think about the disciples around Jesus in this passage, we realize how deep the love of Jesus is. Every time I feel discouraged in my faith, I just go back and I I look at the disciples because they're just so human. One day, not long before this scene, Jesus was having a conversation with his disciples, and he was telling them that soon he would be betrayed, and soon he would die a horrible death. And by this point, we remember that the disciples had been around Jesus for 3 years. They had eaten with Jesus. They had heard him teach. They had seen him walk on water. They had even seen him raise Lazarus from the dead. And Jesus was getting to the final moments of his ministry. He was sharing from his heart, soon I'm going to lose my life. Soon you're going to lose me. And do you remember how the very sensitive disciples respond when Jesus tells them he's about to be crucified? Particularly James and John. Do you remember what they said? Well, they called Jesus off to the side. And they said, in effect, Jesus, I'm really sorry to hear that you're going to suffer and die. That's going to be really rough for you, man. But listen, your kingdom is going to be starting soon. And I was wondering if my brother and me, if we could have seats at your right hand and at your left when you come into your kingdom. I mean, how cool would that be, Jesus, when you reign for eternity, if my brother and me could be on both sides of you? What do you think about that? Jesus is about to face a horrendous death, and his disciples are thinking only about themselves, their own reward, their own ambition. Now, we might expect as we read this that Jesus is just going to send them away for making such a cold and heartless statement. But John tells us, having loved his own, he loved them fully. Jesus shows us what love looks like. He shows the overwhelming, never-ending love of God. And he calls us to love others as he loved his disciples, as he loves us. Love forgives. Love abides. God calls us to use the influence we have to love even those that are most difficult to love. Servant leadership requires love. And secondly, servant leadership requires humility. Look at these next couple of verses. Jesus and his disciples were sharing the evening meal. The devil had already provoked Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew the Father had given everything into his hands and that he had come from God and was returning to God. Jesus knew he had been given all authority and all power. He was the Son of God, but soon we will discover his humility. Humility means choosing not to take advantage of the place God has put you in for your own gain. Humility is using your position, your power, your wealth, your talent, your wonderful location church on this busy corner in Mechanicsburg, using it all to serve others. In 1 Peter 5, which we read one day this past week, the Apostle Peter calls us to seek humility. Let's read these two verses together from 1 Peter chapter 5. Like shepherds, tend the flock of God among you. Watch over it. Don't shepherd because you must, but do it voluntarily for God. Don't shepherd greedily, but do it eagerly. Don't shepherd by ruling over those entrusted to your care, but become examples to the flock. Now, these instructions are specifically for leaders in the church, but they're appropriate for every one of us. We are not called to rule over people, but to watch over them, voluntarily, eagerly, becoming examples for them to follow. Jesus led with humility. He calls us to do the same. And then he shows us, thirdly, that servant leadership requires initiative. Jesus doesn't just talk about servant leadership. He gives a living example of it. Look at verse 4. So, he got up from the table and took off his robes. Picking up a linen towel, he tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a wash basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he was wearing. Now we remember that the culture that Jesus and his disciples lived in had no paved roads, no paved sidewalks, not even a sanitary system, anything like we're accustomed to today. If you've traveled or done mission work in a third world country, you may have witnessed what the byways were like in Jesus' day. Everything ended up on the streets, and then it ended up on the feet of his disciples. Now, the custom of washing feet was so important, and yet in the culture at Jesus' time, it was not even acceptable for a man to do it. And it was not acceptable for an adult woman to do it either. The ideal candidate would typically be a slave girl, about 10 years old perhaps. In a very patriarchal society, no boy, no man, not even mom would wash feet at the table. It had to be a girl washing feet in that culture. So whenever you had a party or a celebration such as this, then there was always some child there to wash the feet. The table was very low, and you didn't want stinking, polluted feet near the food. So here he is, Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus, the Rabbi. This gathering had been going on for a while. They had already had their Coke and their appetizers. They had relaxed. They had gone through this long meal together. They're talking about the Passover. They're talking about how busy the streets are in Jerusalem. And Jesus uses this moment to do something truly revolutionary. Can you imagine the emotion going on when Jesus stands up, takes off his rabbinical robes so that he's completely vulnerable to them, and begins to do that which only a slave would customarily do? I wonder what was going through their minds. I mean, none of them was clamoring to be the first one. You don't see James and John and Peter fighting over who's going to get the wash basin first. They're just kind of sitting back and waiting for someone to serve them. And Jesus gets up, takes off his robe and washes their feet. A powerful lesson in servant leadership. And really a picture of the one who in 2 days after this would lay down his life for the salvation of the world. Servant leadership is loving, humble initiative to serve others as Jesus did. And the thing is, as we read on, we discover that Jesus not only modeled servant leadership, he mandated it. We skip down a few verses to verse 12, and we read this. After he washed his disciples' feet, he put on his robes and returned to his place at the table. And he said to them, "Do you know what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you speak correctly because I am. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you too must wash each other's feet. I have given you an example, just as I have done, you also must do. I assure you, servants aren't greater than their master, nor are those who are sent greater than the one who sent them." Now, if Jesus can get down and get dirty and even wash a betrayer's feet, it takes away every excuse from every Christian at any place, at any time. Now, it's important for us to see that after Jesus washes his disciples' feet, he sits back down at his place at the table. Jesus does not relinquish his leadership as their teacher and Lord. He leverages his influence and takes on the role of a slave so that he can teach his disciples how they too are to be. Friends, if God has given you influence, lead. But do it in a way that will model for the people around you what it looks like to serve the way Jesus calls us to serve. As we come to the end of this passage, Jesus invites us in our home, our workplace, our school, our community, here at church. He invites us to claim the influence we have in his name. And as we do, to lovingly serve. At the end of this scene, Jesus reminds us that being happy is not how you can get. It's how you can give. Since you know these things, he says, you will be happy if you do them.